Hello, this is Martin Brossman, and I'm really excited to be able to interview my doctor and friend, Dr. J.P. Pizzino, that I've known for a long time. A long time. And I truly view you as one of the best doctors I've ever met in my life. And I'm so excited you're willing to start creating some content and information online that people can learn a little bit more about facts, education. So it's really good to have you here.
And I'm very excited to be here. It's really a passion of mine to introduce people to how they can turn on the innate healing powers of their own bodies. That's really what we do in the way that I practice medicine, which is either called integrative medicine or functional medicine. Both of those terms are sort of interchangeable. And basically what that is really looking for root causes of things. So instead of treating symptoms or effects of problems, we're getting them at the root. And when you change the body at the root level, you often help eliminate future diseases as well as whatever's going on now.
Well, and the other thing is your mission really is beyond just survival. It's wellness. You know, what
Absolutely.
I love that. I said, my goal in life is to live a rich life and then that's it.
Go quickly.
Go quickly. And you said that's what your mission is to really support giving people the richest quality of life, which is very important at all aspects of it.
Again, it's really about turning on the innate healing powers of our bodies. None of us actually heal from any kind of medications or even surgeries. Because, for instance, if you have somebody who has an immune deficiency, HIV, or they're on immunosuppressant medications or something, you can give them all the antibiotics in the world, but their immune system can't control infection, and so they're not going to heal. So what we have to do is figure out which of 7 essential functions that are necessary for wellness, which of those are out of balance, get them back into balance, and then the body heals itself. So we actually don't work so much with the 70,000 different diagnoses that most people are familiar with, because those are descriptions of the effects of a problem, not the root causes. So these 7 essential functions are the root causes.
Would you talk a little bit more about those 7 to start with? Because it sounds like pretty important in education.
Right. In no particular order, because they're all equally important. You have what we call assimilation. So this is your ability to pull nutrition out of your food, to pull oxygen out of the air, to assimilate those building blocks that you need to have a healthy body. You have communication, which that's things like neurotransmitters and hormones that are the ways that the body communicates between cells. You have what we call biotransformation and elimination, which a lot of people would call detoxification or detoxication. And so this is how do we get rid of our wastes. We have transport, which in our country, this is probably one of the biggest things that affects people, because this is your blood vessels transporting oxygen, transporting nutrients, transporting wastes out of the body, as well as the lymphatic system, which is really about collecting the wastes. It dumps it into the bloodstream, and then it gets processed either by the kidney or the liver and so forth. We have structure. So this is obviously your structural strength of your skeletal system. We have membranes. So these are the surfaces between cells and as well as inside of cells. So for instance, many people now have heard of mitochondria. This is the little powerhouse inside your cell that turns your food into energy. Well, it has membranes, and those membranes are absolutely essential to what happens, because the membrane is actually the real brain of the cell. So we kind of used to talk about DNA or the nucleus of the cell. That was what we kind of thought of as the brain of the cell. But in reality, it depends on what the cell allows inside of it to determine what turns on or doesn't turn on the genes. And so that is a membrane function. We have energy. So again, that basic energy production. Nothing happens in your body if you don't have energy to fuel it. And so whether you're talking about fighting infection or eliminating wastes or making neurotransmitters or whatever it happens to be, you've got to have the fundamental energy currency of the body being made from your food. And that is actually called ATP. That's how everything gets done.
Get all that working correctly and you have optimum health, basically, right?
Right.
Where does someone start? Because it's so easy to find misinformation, and some, in my view, has come from what we thought were trusted authorities over the years. And, where do you're always a big advocate, I know, of working with a patient and understanding their intuition as well as what makes it. You're kind of training them to notice. And I notice when I really started at least getting off real junk food and just beginning to eat better, that all of a sudden I remember eating a bowl of salad and forgetting to put dressing on it and liking it. So, I think there's an important aspect I remember you mentioned of it takes a little while to switch your body to being addicted to toxins and be addicted to good food. So what you might go, well, I don't like broccoli or I don't like something else is your body's probably so toxic that it's not addicted. And I want you to state it before, but I thought that was really insightful to go, wait a second, just like a runner starting to run, you got to get past that point to really enjoy it. And could you talk about that? Because I think a lot of people go, well, I don't like healthier things, so I won't eat them. Well, maybe you're just so toxic, doesn't taste good.
Well, that's a really good point. It's actually, and the toxins absolutely do play into it, but probably even more important than that is what we call the microbiome. So you may have heard this term. It's referring to all the flora that live on us and in us. So the average human person has about 100 trillion cells, and of that 100 trillion cells, 90 trillion are not human DNA. They are bacteria, viruses, protozoa, parasites, all kinds of different things. And in the past, it's really relatively new science. We've only known about this for about 10 years. And so in the past, we all were told that germs and bacteria were bad for us. But now we know that we cannot live without these things. So most of this is in our guts, and it's in very intimate communication with your immune system. About 2/3 of your immune system is actually in your gut, because no food is sterile, and the outside world is literally what we are taking into ourselves, and so your immune system has to be very active there. And it turns out that these critters, the bacteria and viruses and so forth, emit chemicals that tell you what they want to eat. And so if you have been feeding a certain type of food in, you're going to grow those kind of bugs that want to eat that. And when you change your diet, they're going to go, wait a minute, I really liked French fries or donuts or whatever it was, and they're going to protest. And they may even have little, I say, I'm dying, when you really dramatically change your diet. And this is where some people have, they call it a detox reaction or a healing crisis or the keto flu or different kinds of terminology that people use for why they don't feel so good when they try to make those changes. And so then they end up going back to what they were doing before because they don't feel good. It is a reality that you may have to go through a little bit of that in order to actually get healthy. And one of the things that we do at our clinic, we have many ways to help people minimize the effects of that, so that it isn't such a hard thing to do. One of the things I try to help people do is not beat themselves up because they're craving something. Because it really isn't you craving this.
Yeah.
This isn't a character defect. This is the critters that you've been feeding. And so they're going to say, hey, where's that cheese that you usually give me?
Right.
Or, you know, the popsicle or whatever it happens to be. And they will very vociferously talk to your cells to try to get you to go get what they want. So, for instance, a common scenario is the person is doing whatever they're doing, their work, their leisure activities or whatever, and the thought comes into their head of a cheeseburger or whatever it is that their favorite food is. That's because the microbiome said, it's time for a cheeseburger. Yesterday at 6 o'clock, you fed me a cheeseburger. And so it's 6 o'clock now. I want another one.
They have the puppeteer strings more than we think.
They absolutely do.
One of the best things you told me that I'm finally embracing and fully getting is the fact that carbohydrate addiction runs very similar to a crack addict. And I make jokes. I was teaching the other day, and someone brought in cupcakes. And I said, you need to move those away because I'm a carboholic, you know? And they all laughed. I said, but just imagine if I was a crack addict, would you put crack in front of me? And that's what it's like. And I got the room to laugh, but the truth is, I really felt like I had, before I met you, I had been badly overdosed with steroids, where I gained my weight and so forth. But the addiction for years has been like, how do I have such poor willpower? You know, and I realized all of my system has been committed to feeding that addiction. When I started, if there was a bowl of candy over there, I would be drawn to it the whole time I'm sitting here. Mm-hmm. You know,
it's calling you.
Right. I think we should really treat some of this like someone who has a tragic addiction. You know, because it runs addiction. Like that. You know,
it's a tragic addiction because it is killing us.
Right.
Sugar is killing more people than cigarettes, more people than alcohol, more people than AIDS, a lot more people. We have a diabetes epidemic. We have a heart disease epidemic. We have a stroke epidemic. All of those things are directly linked to sugar addiction.
I've now cut out all intentional sugar. Now, if I get something in a sauce I miss, I just keep going, you know, but nothing intentionally with sugar. I've had friends who have battled real chemical addictions, and it feels like that. You know, it's felt like that with it. Now, I didn't feel the need to go to a support group, but I'd understand someone who does. And there
are support groups that deal with addictive eating behaviors.
Yes, and I think more power to anyone smart enough to use a tool like that. But that's one of the things I thought was so valuable, is realizing, one, we're addicted to the toxic foods and the food that doesn't serve us. And the other thing is that we have to move through the process, it seems like, to get over to the other side. Now, I was there and then I fell back. My parents and health and family and even some of the green drinks, you know, when was toxic, it tasted like real pond scum, you know. And then when I started getting healthier, it actually tasted good.
Well, it literally changes the creatures that are growing on your tongue. So the
senses, everything.
It absolutely tastes different because the things that are growing there are triggering different taste buds. So that is absolutely vital. And it's a process, you know, nobody changes immediately overnight, and there's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. We know that that's typical. Getting your stress under control, or at least managing stress. We tend to think of stress as a mental, emotional thing, but stress is a very physical thing.
Sure.
And so a lot of it has to do with our adrenal glands, which produce cortisol, which is similar to those steroids that you were talking about being overdosed on. And those steroids are all about making us bulk up.
Yeah.
Because when we have that fight or flight reaction, your body says, well, I need to be bigger in order to fight whatever is out there. And so the steroids make things hang on to us. So this is the typical person who gains weight around the middle. That is almost always associated with stress. And so that's what that hormone does, the cortisol. It makes us gain weight, particularly around the middle. And a lot of people tend to think of insulin as the hormone that manages blood sugar. And that is true, that insulin has a lot to do with blood sugar. But insulin is about the sugar going into the cell. The maintenance of blood sugar is actually cortisol. And so this is where the management of our stress, so that it isn't triggering excessive cortisol release from our adrenal glands, that is really, really key to being able to manage this. And I do want to step back a moment and really make the point, because a lot of people get very confused when they hear the term blood sugar, and they think that has to do with sweet things. It does have to do with sweet things, but that's not actually the main source for most people. So there are many things that turn into sugar in the body, and that would be anything that's starchy. So anything made out of wheat, corn, or rice, anything made out of potatoes or other kinds of root vegetables, those aren't necessarily sweet, but they are turned into blood sugar, which is also known as blood glucose more technically. So I try to use that term with people when we're talking about blood glucose, because our language tends to right away say, well, I don't eat sweet things. I don't have a sweet tooth, but I eat plenty of pasta and pizza and French fries and baked potatoes, and all of those things are every bit equivalent to sugar in terms of what they turn into in the body.
Very important. I want to mention what occurred for me was I had a severe reaction to poison ivy years ago, and they thought that it was spreading, and what happened is the steroids activated hives and shingles, so they kept resetting the steroids, and when they were done, I was a train wreck. Independent guy going to the patch and go, nothing wrong with those places when they serve, but I had no one really looking at it. And it was a naturopath that one time said, it's like someone put a giant bucket over your nervous system and hit it as hard as they could. And might ring for a while. And it has for many years. And I literally gained 100 pounds overnight. It threw my system off. And so it's been a long battle. And then now I've really gotten to the point where, okay, now let's take care of it and address it. And one of the things that also was fascinating is a friend was borderline diabetic. He says, I'm no longer that at all. And I said, what was the solution? And he said, I wasn't eating enough fats. And that's the next topic I'd like to talk about. I'd like you to talk a little bit about this theory of fat, because I grew up in cut it out, and it seemed, let's replace it with sugar and carbohydrates and chemicals. I think that's what is the plan, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's unfortunately the truth of what's happened. And if you look at the obesity epidemic in our country, it specifically correlates with when everyone was being told to avoid fat. And just kind of to summarize the science, the truth of it is that was bad science. If you want to learn more about how and why that's bad science, I recommend there's a great book, Eat Fat, Get Thin by Mark Hyman. He really delves into the science of that. Dr. Mercola has Fat for Fuel, where they examine more of this. But it is true that we got sidetracked because when they saw these fatty plaques in the arteries, they said, well, it must be fat that is causing this. But the way the body actually metabolizes, it's really the carbohydrates getting turned into storage fats. probably the most important thing that everyone needs, whether or not you're a diabetic, is a slow, steady blood sugar. And when we eat carbohydrates, particularly refined carbohydrates of any sort, whether it's starches or sugars, that causes the blood sugar to spike and fall and spike and fall. So it goes up really fast, your insulin comes on board, pushes it down, you get hungry, you eat some more carbohydrates, and it happens over and over and over throughout the day. And this is why most people are actually hungry all the time when they are what we call carb adapted, which is almost everybody in our country. We are carb adapted. We eat lots of carbs. And so we're constantly playing with this blood sugar issue. This is especially important if you have energy problems of any sort. It's especially important if you have any kind of brain issues, whether we're talking about mood issues, concentration issues, memory issues.
Probably ADD too, which just seems everywhere, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because the brain really is very sensitive to these fluctuations in the blood sugar. So what we want is we want to even out those fluctuations. And one of the ways to do that is to eat more fat and less carbs. It is important to eat more fat with less carbs because the combination of the fat and carbs together, that's a really bad combination, and that's really what puts the plaques in the arteries.
I see.
And
so
so
you
this
have both
is
of them. You're really, it's like a power boost with the fat. Here's the sugar, deliver the fat to them, right?
Exactly. So, that's like a donut. It's like pizza. Many of them, it's the cheeseburger. So, those things have that combination of both things, and that's why they're not very healthy for you, because they really are very inflammatory, which not only causes the fat to stick on, it specifically tells it to deposit it in the arteries. And so inflammation is what we have learned is actually the root cause: heart disease, Alzheimer's, strokes, diabetes, osteoporosis, cancer. All of these things are actually caused by inflammation. And if we remember that 2/3 of our immune system is in the gut, what you eat determines whether or not you're inflamed more than anything else that there is. What we're eating is not just those building blocks of proteins and fats and carbs. It is also the micronutrients, so particularly plant products, your colored plants, especially your greens and reds and yellows and oranges and so forth. Those have what are called phytonutrients, which means plant-derived nutrients, that are present in micro amounts, and they turn on the most beneficial factors in your body. Most people who do what we call the SAD diet, the standard American diet, have too little of the colors because they're eating a lot of refined grains and white potatoes and meats, and not enough of those phytonutrients to tell the body what to do with the macronutrients. It's really a double whammy, because not only are we eating inflammatory foods, we're not eating enough of those micronutrients to actually tell the body how to clean up the damage from that.
Where do you start with fats? I mean, where's the beginning? Because obviously you shouldn't go out and get a pack of Slim Jims and carry it with you or something, Where do you start with the fats?
Well, it's very interesting because a lot of people end up choosing something like a low-carb paleo sort of a diet. And if you haven't heard of paleo before, it's short for Paleolithic. And the idea is it's what we call an ancestral diet. Over 250,000 years of human evolution, that's what we ate. Our ancestors were hunter-gatherers, and they did not have a cow following them through the jungle. They didn't drink dairy products or eat dairy products of any sort. I happen to be somebody who's a really big proponent of no dairy because humans are the only animals that drink another animal's milk, and we're the only animals that drink milk after weaning. And there is quite a bit of evidence that dairy is very inflammatory. And it wasn't present in our nutritional background until about 10,000 years ago when we first got agriculture. And it takes about 50,000 years for mutations to happen. And so we haven't really evolved to be able to eat that yet.
Right.
It's the same thing about grains. Grains, Stone Age people did not go around cutting the heads off of grasses, which rice and corn and wheat are all grasses. And so that wasn't part of our diet until 10,000 years ago. Those two things were definitely not in our diet. And when we were hunter-gatherers, we were eating lean meat on the hoof that was literally, pasture-raised, forest-raised, or whatever. It wasn't grain-fed, which is what most of our factory farming produces our meats and poultry and things like that now. If you actually follow a true Paleolithic diet, you actually really need to eat grass-fed, pasture-raised, free-range, those kinds of meats. Part of the problem, you mentioned chemicals earlier and how toxic we are. We know that if you tend to be someone who concentrates chemicals, which we live in an unprecedented level of chemicals that human beings have never before the current generation been exposed to these levels of chemicals. And again, we're not evolutionarily adapted to that. If you tend to concentrate chemicals, which many of these are fat-soluble chemicals, so they do tend to concentrate in the fat, it increases your risk of diabetes 38 times, which is a more strong association with causing diabetes than smoking cigarettes is to cause lung cancer.
Wow.
So this is a very, very powerful association. And it not only causes diabetes, it causes more weight gain. So even if you don't end up with diabetes from it, you do end up in that vicious circle of gaining more and more weight because of the toxins. And again, because we're not eating enough of those colored phytonutrients that we need to clean up that chemical mess.
Wow. And one of the simple ones you mentioned years ago to me was just avocados is a good source of fats, right?
An excellent fat, yes. Avocados,
because that's a place to start. So.
Right. Olives, nuts, coconuts, all of those are good, natural kinds of fats that we evolved to eat, lots of. I recommend to people to really minimize their grain intake as much as possible. And people will ask about things like, what about quinoa or millet or some of these other types of, they're not technically grains. However, they are very high on what we call the glycemic index, which is how fast something turns into sugar in the bloodstream. When I'm talking about low carb, I am talking about minimizing them as well. Even some of our very sugary fruits, bananas, pineapple, grapes, dried fruits, these turn into sugar instantaneously in the body.
Orange juice.
Or juices of any sort that don't have,
natural
we have to have the
are,
fiber from the fruit. So you're really much better off eating an orange with all the fibers and so forth in it than you are drinking the juice. Same thing for apple or, any other kinds of juices. So we minimize those while we are increasing fats because you are still going to need some energy. And if you increase those good fats, sauteing your vegetables in olive oil or coconut oil. If you're using high heat like stir fry, you want to use coconut oil or avocado oil because it doesn't go bad when it gets into high heat. Having slices of avocado every day, having a small handful of nuts. Some people get too much into, overdoing it, and you can overdo it on either way. Another thing that I see people overdo when they go lower carb is they eat lots of meat. And so their diet, again, doesn't have the colors in it because they're eating, big slabs of meat and chilies made of mostly meat and things like that. And that has a couple of problems. One is that protein actually can turn into glucose in the bloodstream also. Fat does not turn into carbohydrates. So fat stays as fat and can be burned as fat. And whereas protein can get turned into carbohydrates in the bloodstream. The other problem with eating very large amounts of protein is that it's really hard on the kidneys because it is very acidifying in our bodies. And when we're too acidic, that really causes us to rob Peter to pay Paul because we need a more neutral pH. And so that's an issue. And then when we get back to this issue of the amount of chemicals that we're exposed to, the FDA permits 1,000 times higher pesticide residues on animal feed than what is going to go into human feed.
Wow.
And so when you eat a factory farmed animal that has been fed those pesticides, they've concentrated it in their flesh or their milk or their eggs. And so you're actually getting even higher doses of chemicals from eating animal products than from eating it sprayed onto human food. I tell people, especially if you're cost conscious and you're wondering where do you spend your food dollars on organic foods, you are actually better off spending it on organic pasture-raised animal products than even on whether or not it's a vegetable. Because the pesticide residues are so much higher in the animal products.
Wow. This is the beginning of hopefully a very long series because everything you brought up could go deep dive tremendously. But water, I remember you just saying, I said, can you give me any tips since I'm taking care of my parents to watch out, and said hydration. Make sure they're drinking enough. Because what happens is as people age, they want to not have to go to the bathroom as much and so forth. Well, I think you said if you're thirsty, if you feel thirsty, you're now severely dehydrated. That's the threshold. You're way, if it's like got you at your attention, you're way beyond it.
Right.
And this is another thing of people not liking, quote, the taste of water. And I think that has to do with also toxicity, getting it, because I'm really enjoying the taste of water. And there was a point I didn't. It had to be flavored or something else. So could you talk about water and the importance of it?
Actually, water is, if you want to start somewhere, I think water is the easiest thing to do. Okay? You don't have to give up anything.
Right.
Really. We do want good sources of clean water. That, again, is a deep dive discussion.
Right. We'll have to have a whole show on that.
But we'll assume that you live in a place that has good water that you can receive. There are some things that are actually negative that pull water out of your body. So caffeine, bubbles of any sort, so any kind of soda, seltzers, most artificial sweeteners other than stevia.
I see.
They all actually dehydrate us. So if you are drinking anything, even if it's just sparkling water, it is actually not going to hydrate you.
Wow, that's a big deal.
Yeah, that's a very big deal. The general recommendation is that you drink half your weight in ounces of water every day.
That's a lot of water. I'm sorry.
It is a lot of water.
It takes
and
a while.
I qualify that because it's really half your lean weight.
Okay.
So if you're particularly overweight, you might want to look up what are you supposed to weigh for your height, because that would be your lean weight, and it would be that many ounces.
Okay, gotcha.
So a typical woman, that's about 2 quarts a day. A typical man, depending on how active you are, if you're out cutting grass a lot or running or something, you're going to need more. A man's going to be 2.5 to 3 quarts a day.
Okay.
So that's
helpful.
That 2 quarts or 2.5 quarts means, in addition to anything that you're drinking that's got caffeine or bubbles or artificial sweeteners in it.
Right.
Because
that takes away from it.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
Because the caffeine's not just not giving me fluid. The coffee's actually dehydrating me, so I need more water to compensate. Is that correct?
Exactly. Wow. A lot of times what we are is reaching for food when what we really are is thirsty. And so this is where you see, when the paparazzi capture all of the stars, they're all walking around with a bottle of water.
I see.
Because they've been told that they need to be drinking water all day long because it helps them to stay thin and so forth. And it'll help you to stay thin too, to be drinking water all day long. That is the first rule of thumb, is just reach for some water before you reach for the food, and you may find that that is what you need. Particularly if you're somebody who tends to retain water, your rings get tight, your socks are making dents around your ankles, that kind of stuff. That means you're dehydrated.
I see.
The water has gone outside of your cells into the surrounding tissues, so your cells are actually dehydrated when that happens. And so those people really need to up the water intake.
I just remembered a real estate guy in D.C. who's lost a huge amount of weight, and I said, "What did you do?" And he said, "Drank more water." And then he said, "No, more than you ever imagined." It's like...
Well, there's actually studies that show if you simply drink 17 ounces of water, which is about the size of a, average bottle, that increases your metabolism 30%.
I see.
Because now you put the water inside the cell, all of those nutrients and everything, they have to slosh around like in soup in order to actually be used. And so if they're just sort of sitting at the bottom of the bucket because there's not enough water to slosh them around, they aren't really being metabolized. So you pour in some of that water, they start sloshing around, you burn the energy, and you're able to actually have a higher metabolism simply because of that.
Two more things I want to bring up. We'll wrap up this beginning piece. But one is, I'm really clear that combination of keeping on the weight, of addiction and stress, the addiction to the carbs that developed and not healthy food, and then the stress. But the other thing is just at a certain level of stress, the extra weight seems to numb me to so that I don't have to face uncomfortable feelings. And so I'd like you to talk about the emotional aspects of this, because it is a changing of kind of who you are at identity level. So make it an upgrade,
I'm so glad that you brought that up, Martin, because especially for men, they're often told to ignore their emotions altogether.
Right.
And so unless it's a real positive emotion, they're not even supposed to acknowledge that it's there. And so just acknowledging that as humans, emotions are built into us. It's not escapable. It's part of the human condition. There is nothing wrong with having emotions, and handling them in a constructive way rather than a destructive way. And certainly trying to stuff them down with food that has negative consequences for our bodies is a pretty destructive
short-term gain.
Exactly.
Long-term failure.
It's effective because it triggers that parasympathetic nervous system to digest.
I see.
And so I'll just go back to talk about the nervous system a little bit because it's so affected by our emotions. So the autonomic nervous system is running everything in the background. This is, I call it your operating system, like in your computer. It's beating your heart, controls blood pressure, digests your food, sexual function. All of these things are happening automatically in the background. It has two branches. One branch is called the sympathetic nervous system, which is fight or flight or freeze. That's, run away from the tiger. And the parasympathetic nervous system, which is rest and digest and repair. And in our modern, very stressful world, we are always running away from the tiger. That tiger may be those unpleasant emotions, which in addition to grief can include anger and fear. Those are the kind of the big three unpleasant emotions, and they have a lot of different variations and so forth. But we don't want to feel those things. They're not socially acceptable in a lot of cases and so forth. The body cannot tell the difference between there really is a tiger behind me and I think there's a tiger behind me. And so in our modern world, we don't actually have a lot of tigers, but we do think that there are a lot of tigers. And so we're in that sympathetic nervous system, beating the heart hard, raising the blood pressure, raising blood sugar, raising cholesterol. All of those are functions of the sympathetic nervous system. When we rest and digest and repair, that's why we eat something. So now we have triggered, I can finally relax. Maybe I can fall asleep. I might toss down a little bit of alcohol with it, because that would really help to trigger that rest system. But we're not triggering it in a natural way. We're using these things artificially to do that. And so, first of all, simply being able to be with an emotion and just admit that it's there, which you don't really have to admit to anyone else. You only have to admit it to yourself. Now, that's not to say that sometimes professional help isn't helpful, or support groups, friends, you know, many different ways of dealing with that. But if we don't admit that it's there, and we're simply stuffing it down with cigarettes or alcohol or food or excessive work or excessive exercise or whatever we're running away from the tiger with, then we can't deal with it if we're not going to admit that it's there. I think a lot of people are aware that they emotionally eat, or they have to have those couple of drinks at the end of the day just to calm down, but they aren't necessarily exploring other ways to deal with those emotions. And so there are some very constructive ways that you can deal with them. As we said, there's professional help and friends and so forth. The most effective ways that research has shown is actually something called mindfulness. You may have heard of mindfulness in connection with meditation. They're not exactly the same thing, but they're similar. You don't have to have a religious orientation of any sort in order to do mindfulness, because basically what mindfulness means is becoming present in the present moment. So being here now without judgment. So we are just being with whatever happens to be. So if I'm grieving, I'm grieving. I'm admitting, yes, I miss this person who's no longer with me, or I miss the job that I'm no longer at, or friends, or whatever it happens to be. Learning how to be with that without doing something about it. So you mentioned that men tend to be doers, and in our modern society, women also are doers. And so what do? We stuff it down with something. Prayer can be very helpful. Journaling. This is one of the ways where exercise comes into play, because healthy exercise, which of course can be taken to an extreme, but healthy exercise literally helps your body act like it's running away from the tiger, and so it burns off that excessive energy that was built up from the stress that's pounding at it. And then that allows that parasympathetic nervous system to be able to relax much better. And so those are all healthy ways that you can cope with that stress instead of stuffing it down.
That's why I wanted to go to next is advice on exercise, because that's activity. We live many of us, very passive life. And I just remember in college, I was pretty wound up, and I used to swim 2 miles to relax enough to study. Now, if anyone knows anything about swimming, that was a long time, you know, but it worked, at least it worked. So I'd hit the pool, I'd swim, I'd get out, and then I could sit still and study. Physical activity and rest.
Well, you made such a good point there. And this, in our modern world, with so many things bombarding our attention all the time, that's part of the stress. We can't even focus on them, how many balls can I catch at one time? And so the exercise literally calms that sympathetic nervous system down enough so that you can pay attention to what you need to concentrate on. That's another really good benefit of exercise. Exercise is the fountain of youth. We talked about water. That's one thing that everybody can do, even if you don't change your diet. Exercise is the other thing, even if you don't change your diet.
Get out the door and walk.
take a walk.
Yeah.
There's the Japanese do something called forest bathing,
Right.
which is they actually quite a bit of data about this, how it lowers blood pressure and has other beneficial effects simply being out in nature. Everybody's got two legs, and you don't have to pound it in running to get benefit from it. There are benefits from doing more intensive exercise, and if you want to get really physically fit, then the studies show that what is called high intensity interval training, or HIIT, is actually the thing that triggers it best in your body. And particularly if you're crunched for time and you don't have a lot of time to exercise, choosing high intensity interval training is the biggest bang for the buck.
Which is,
And
was,
so this
yeah.
is so, for instance, they put people on exercise bicycles and they had them bike intensively for a half hour, like aerobic biking. And then they had them do a minute on or a minute off for 20 minutes. And the people who did the really powerful minute on, relax for a minute, do another intense minute for 20 minutes were more physically fit than the people who did it continuously for 30 minutes.
So it's like sprinting. Someone said as a Homo sapien staying alive, our activity wasn't long distance running. It was sprinting away from something trying to eat us.
Right.
You know?
Exactly. And this is like a spin class,
Right.
doing wind sprints. Even if you you go for your walk and you walk for a minute and maybe you jog for a minute. You know, just
Or walk
raise
real
it.
fast and pause, and slow. Walk real fast
Exactly.
and pause. And then I was thinking of kettlebells is another one. A friend of mine loves it, and I remember I started for a while and didn't, it was so funny because something happened. I had to move the refrigerator, and Barbara, my wife, goes, "You've never been that strong." You know, I was just doing these kettlebell things and in intervals, and it was a short period of time, and I was worn out. You know, so I think that's excellent. We've talked about exercise. Now tell me about sleep.
So sleep is one of those things that is absolutely essential. There is no way of getting around it. It's a requirement that I have, because if we are not sleeping, we are not resting and digesting and repairing. And so it's not an optional thing. There are studies that show if we sleep less than 6 hours a night, you shorten your life. So 7 to 8 is a good goal. You really need to watch the use of screens, and that means your phone, your tablet, your computer, your television. They have shown that these all have actually a background blue light that triggers your body to think it's waking up. So, you know, evolutionarily, when the sun was coming up and the sky got blue, that was get up and go. And so when now we are in artificial light all day long, and when we have blue light coming at us at 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night, the body thinks that it's still supposed to be awake. It really is a matter of just saying no to screens at least 1 hour and preferably 2 hours before you go to bed. So anybody who's having trouble sleeping, that's one of the things that I absolutely require that. And then all the other things that are going on in our lives that are pushing that stress button. When we're running away from the tiger, we're not going to fall asleep. We need to do that stress management in order to get the good night's sleep. Certain drugs sometimes are useful if we're having short-term problems with sleeping, but if you're having a pattern of not having good sleep and you have to use benzodiazepines like Ativan and Valium or Zolpidem, these have been associated with higher incidences of dementia and cancer. So these are not drugs that you want to use long term. And we need to figure out what you need to do to sleep better.
Excellent. Well, how can they reach you? This was terrific. Hopefully we'll do a deeper dive on other topics. So what's the best way to reach you?
Our clinic is called Whole Health Solutions. That's WHOLE, Health Solutions. And the website is that word hyphenated. So www.whole-health-solutions.com. We're in Cary, North Carolina, and we also do telemedicine consultations. So we're happy to help you learn more about how to deal with these
So
things.
you can reach people over a larger distance too. Excellent. Dr. JP, this was excellent. I'm excited, and I'm really very grateful for you to take the time so that we could get this first recording, and maybe there'll be many more. So thanks. If you liked it, like, share, comment. Want to hear from you, and look forward to seeing more in the future. This is Martin Brossman. Have a great day.